April 8, 2026 marks the moment the existing model of Middle Eastern power dynamics shifted. The assumption that a superpower could dictate the map of the region through air superiority met a hard limit. At the start of the conflict, the technological gap appeared insurmountable. The United States and Israel deployed wings of F-35 stealth fighters and precision-guided armor against a country that had spent decades cut off from the global parts and technology markets. Conventional military logic dictated a 48-hour collapse for the Iranian state, particularly after a targeted strike killed the supreme leader on day one of the war. That predicted collapse never happened. Iran's military and civilian infrastructure remained operational, eventually forcing the United States and Israel into a negotiated ceasefire. The resulting treaty granted Tehran nearly every major objective. Iran retained its domestic missile program and uranium enrichment. It secured regional non-aggression guarantees for its allies and mandated the removal of all international sanctions. The gap between this hardware advantage and the final diplomatic result suggests that conventional weapons were neutralized by factors the Pentagon's wargames failed to account for. The coalition strategy relied on the idea that surgical strikes on infrastructure would turn the public against the government, triggering an internal revolution that would end the war from within. Instead, the threat of bombardment created a human shield. In Tehran and Isfahan, thousands formed physical chains around power plants, bridges, and historic sites, effectively betting the coalition wouldn't risk the global fallout of a mass casualty event on live television. This domestic unity included the Iranian Jewish community, whose leaders publicly criticized the Israeli strikes and remained within the country to stand with the civilian defense. Air superiority loses its utility when a population is willing to stand in the path of the bombs. By removing the fear of destruction, the civilian population removed the coalition's primary tool of coercion. This local resistance provided the time needed for a global shift. Russia and China used their veto power at the UN to block any resolution that failed to condemn the initial strikes on Iranian soil, leaving the US and Israel without a legal mandate for continued action. This left the region divided between those who hedged their bets and those who committed early. The UAE's attempts to secure a post-war advantage through anti-Iran rhetoric failed, while Oman's early neutrality made it the primary hub for the coming trade boom. Pakistan filled the diplomatic vacuum left by the West. By hosting foreign ministers from across the Islamic world, the Pakistani government drafted the 20-day ceasefire that both Washington and Tehran eventually signed. While Pakistan became a regional mediator, India was excluded from the negotiations. The Indian Prime Minister's vocal support for the Israeli Knesset and his subsequent silence during the bombing of Iranian civilians left New Delhi with no credibility among the mediators drafting the peace. The failure to secure a swift military victory triggered a political crisis in Washington. Faced with the reality of a prolonged stalemate, members of Congress initiated the 25th Amendment process to remove the president, citing the instability of his administration. Iran didn't need to defeat the F-35 in the air. They waited for the coalition's political will to disintegrate under the pressure of international isolation and internal scandal. Iran ensured long-term recovery by leveraging geography. The treaty formalized their control over the Strait of Hormuz. Every commercial ship passing through this corridor must now pay a $2 million toll, funding the reconstruction of damaged Iranian cities. Because this strait carries a fifth of the world's oil, every nation that imports fuel is now directly contributing to the Iranian treasury. The treaty achieved two things at once. It forced the removal of the sanctions that had choked Iran's economy for decades, while the toll provided the immediate capital needed to rebuild the country's power grid and bridges. With the legal barriers to trade gone, the Iranian economy is beginning to reflect its actual scale, tapping into a domestic market that had been suppressed for a generation. Evidence of this potential is visible in the Tabiat Bridge in Tehran. Designed by a female Iranian engineer, the project represents the domestic expertise previously hidden from the world by travel bans and professional sanctions. The agricultural sector is moving just as fast. Iran is currently moving back into the top spot as the world's leading pistachio exporter, reclaiming market share that had been taken by California growers during the peak of the sanctions era. This growth is happening under a fragile peace. Israel has not applied the ceasefire terms to its operations in Lebanon, and the threat of intelligence-led sabotage remains a constant variable in the region. Any attempt to restart the war faces an intact deterrent. Iran currently maintains 15,000 missiles and 45,000 drones, a force specifically built to saturate air defenses if the treaty is violated. April 2026 demonstrated that military hardware cannot solve a conflict against a nation leveraging its geography, its regional neighbors and allies, and the resilience of its people to make the cost of war higher than any superpower is willing to pay.